Immortal and undying, the Orokin Empire expanded to colonize the Origin system in its entirety, choking it not just with planetary populations, but with orbital outposts, lunar colonies, residential ships, and entire spacefaring vessels housing thousands upon thousands of lives. The average lifespan, even for the common folk, stretched into the centuries, and soon the Empire was faced with a critical problem. Available resources were rapidly running out. For as powerful as they were, the Orokin had thus far been tethered to the Origin system, unable to reach beyond the outer terminus and land upon distant shores. But with the noose of scarcity closing around their necks, the Orokin at last were moved beyond idealism and into desperation. Many ideas were explored, including the crewman and sentient rail construction projects, but all had ultimately failed. Thus, another, even grander endeavor was created, the Zariman colonization project. A massive, fully sustainable colonial vessel that would reach Tau and establish an endpoint for the failed solar rail network to Tau. The journey would be facilitated by an extremely powerful on-board void translation system using an unholy, quantum-tethered fragment of the void, the reliquary drive. Its power would allow for transit independent of the safer yet more constrained solar rail network. As an aside, it is unclear in which order the projects were taken, as the Sentient Rail project had been designed with the intent of a stable solar rail network between Tau and the Origin system, but dialogue from Tavol indicates that the rail was not completed, necessitating the massive free jump. From my understanding, the Sentient project was initiated first, terraformed Tau, but failed to complete the rail, and the Zariman was sent to complete the rail and establish the first set of stable colonies on what the Orokin assumed would be a mostly, if not completely, terraformed planet. However, it is just as likely that the projects were taken in the opposite order, and the Sentient project was accepted due to the desperation of the Seven after the failure of the Zariman, which may have even been the ill-fated crewman project mentioned in the synthesis lore. Heading the Zariman project was Executor Tavol, acting as benefactor and patron of the project. With his guidance, thousands of citizens across the Empire were chosen as participants to take the voyage. Given the omniscience of the Orokin, they were selected based on traits both genetic and cerebral that would suit the designs the Orokin had in mind for their colonies. It is critical to mention that this process was not voluntary. While painted as purely magnanimous, and a gift greater than they deserved, the citizens chosen had no say in the matter and were forced into service. Aboard the self-sufficient Zariman, the colonists were largely independent, a thought that disgusted the Orokin who valued their absolute dominion. Thus, Tavol, expecting that there may be dissent among those who were less than thankful for the gift he had given them, used the relatives of the colonists as leverage, threatening that should the Zariman fail to meet expectations, those of their bloodlines who had remained in the Origin system would be punished in their stead. Of those who were selected, there were the 5 who would become the Holdfasts that the Tenno interacts with much later after the New War. First was Hombask. Chosen as the head of homesteading, Hombask was a well-liked and beloved member of the crew amongst the lower class. Her task was not only in streamlining the initial colonization period once the ship reached Tau and encouraging self-sufficiency amongst the colonists, but in ensuring that life aboard the ship during transit was comfortable, easing the journey for the colonists, many of which may have experienced limited or even no time at all on spacefaring vessels prior to the selection. Vistograph therapy was mandated to alleviate any adverse psychological effects from the prolonged interstellar travel, and the large, spacious dormizomes were outfitted with amenities to mitigate the sensation of being trapped aboard a vessel against one's will. Next was Cavallero, head of ship security. Though he speaks little of his past, it is likely he was counted among the mercenary class similar to Orden Karras prior to his conscription aboard the Zariman. A warrior of some renown, his reputation even earned attention from Parvos Granum, who attempted to recruit him as an enforcer at one point. His open disdain for the Orokin elite seems strange at first, given his position, but there is a strong argument to be made that the Zariman crew were chosen perhaps for their lack of loyalty. Capable, but with wavering fealty to the Empire, it is very possible that the crew was comprised of those who the Empire would not miss, or perhaps even sought to be rid of. Sacrificial lambs who the Orokin could placate through a simulacrum of independence, or be rid of entirely should the Zariman project end in failure. Third was Yonta, in charge of calculating and orchestrating the void jumps using the ship's onboard systems. Though an Archimedean, the way she speaks of the past indicates she was not one of high standing, talking of her old fears and self-doubts, dreading that she would fall below the acceptable standards of the Orokin had set and be put to death for her failure. Her eagerness to prove herself not just loyal, but valuable, made her a useful pawn for the Orokin, as their disregard for the colonists' safety would lead to their ruinous order to take the final jump to Tau. Fourth was Quinn, the liaison to Expeditionary Command, and direct line of communication for Tivol, who oversaw the project. Not the captain of the ship directly, but the direct stand-in for the Orokin and their will. It can be assumed that prior to the expedition, Quinn was a loyal servant of the Empire, pious even, as Cavallero calls him. Though he would in time grow to hate the Golden Lords like all the others, at the time of the Zariman's voyage, he carried out their will with pride. Though he is vague, he speaks longingly of a previous love, suggested to be Eularia and Trotty. It is implied that the marriage between Eularia and Vilcor was largely a political one, and Quinn may have not just been pining for her affection prior to the arrangement, but romantically involved. After losing his love to a political maneuver, and then further to her desperate pursuit of Albrecht's dark legacy, Quinn sought to serve his empire and prove to himself he still had worth, and his eagerness to appeal to his Golden Lords led him to commit the atrocities he would be forced to regret for an eternity. For Quinn was granted the privilege of the Crystal Index, a direct manifest of all members of the Zariman who, with naught but a swipe of his finger, Quinn could immediately and unilaterally condemn to glassing, the hand of the Orokin law, acting in their stead where they could not reach. And then there is the fifth member of the Holdfasts, Kira. A member of Yonta's Void operations team, she assisted in calculating the jumps across the Void, and also seems to be an expert in communication across the Void, an extremely difficult task given the Void's non-Euclidean space and its stratification of multiple timelines simultaneously. Though the Tenno does not meet her directly until after she succumbs to the Void, Kira's role in saving the Zariman is critical, and without her, the Zariman may very well have shattered and let the horrors on the other side of the wall into the system. But that's jumping ahead a bit, so we will put her actions aside for now. As the Zariman was set to embark, even Ballas offered his seal of approval. He granted the Zariman Gyra, a silent and graceful dancer who would serve as figurehead for the voyage. While this occurs long before Ballas's eventual fascination with Warframes, given his proclivity for anatomical perfection and human experimentation, there is sickening possibility regarding Gyra's past and her position as an object for Ballas to give. While likely poetic, Quinn's mention of Gyra speaking with her movement is even more concerning if taken literally, given how the Warframes themselves would intentionally be rendered mute by Ballas when he designed them in the future. With the crew chosen, the blessing of the Golden Lords, and the path set, the Zariman began its parade route through the system, a path that served a dual purpose. First and foremost, to inspire awe and envy among the lower class not chosen by the Golden Lords, a massive display of Orokin power gliding gracefully between the starving planets, not restricted by the solar rails, embodying hope for a future beyond the outer terminus and an Orokin empire spread wide across the stars. Second, and more pragmatic, the escalating series of small void jumps between colonies and outposts in the system would serve as a starting point for the voyage, testing the onboard translation systems in relative safety to gauge void exposure on the crew, and giving the engineers a chance to warm up to the progressively larger jumps they would need to make as they crossed to Tau. During the slow jump schedule, most of the ship was occupied with routine tasks. The adults carried out their duties aboard the ship, and the children were educated in the key principles of void travel and its theories as a precautionary measure, being granted access to privileged information unprecedented for the average commoner of the system, let alone a child. For the colonization effort needed a host of children to establish a diverse age range on Tau, but void travel for children was exceptionally dangerous. With active imaginations and volatile emotions, children were the most unstable element to introduce into the mimicking void, and were significantly more prone to causing rampant conceptual embodiment. Thus, their education was carried out by ship cephalons like Melika, and the recorded teachings of Eularia and Trotty, a master of void science second only to her father. In her own way, Eularia's simplified teachings were a method of offering protection to the children thrown into the waters they could not understand by the uncaring Empire. She could not stop the Zariman project, but she could at least lend her voice in an attempt to prepare the children for the threats that lurked in the moments when crossing the fold. As the jumps escalated, a signal operator named Brack saw an opportunity to finish a personal project they had been working on for some time, a time capsule of information sent into deep space similar to the Voyager records of our time. Previous attempts with personal tech had failed, and so Brack sought to hijack the Zariman communication arrays and launch the data into the Great Unknown. A simple package containing crude depictions of humans, the origin system, the Zariman, and binary logic, with additional room to encode further information. All Brack needed was an opportune moment and assistance from another crew member, Mykos. To alleviate the fear of the crew and reinforce their faith in the Empire, the Zariman recited daily mantras. First, their oath to the Golden Lords. By the glory and wisdom of the Seven, I give my life to carry the sacred light of our dominion into the deepest dark. In this, we are one. And then the second, more self-assuring recitation, we shall not fear to take the leap across the gulf to fare, though all between is dark and deep, a home awaits us there. But even during the initial jumps, there were already signs of strain aboard the Zariman. The open wound of the void they carried with them, the reliquary drive, began to bleed its corrupting power into the ship. Those who lingered close, such as Yonta, would see grinning reflections of themselves lurking on the edges of their vision, or experience confusing dreams. Each jump further spread the poison, and numerous members of the crew began to exhibit psychosis and erupt into sudden, violent outbursts. Incidents spiked in their frequency and damage and led to deaths, further stress, and confusion on the ship. In one such incident, the aggressor, Hanya, claimed that her partner had been replaced, that there were doppelgangers masquerading as her friends and family aboard the ship, the brief flickers of the void impacting her ability to stay anchored to a single time and place. The ship's security teams began to grow restless, as the Orokin had forbidden the colonists to carry any conventional weapons, likely fearing a potential uprising. Instead, the weapons were purely ornamental or ceremonial, and the security teams grew far more brutal to compensate as they became further and further stretched thin. But rather than taking precautions to limit the ship's exposure, the Orokin demanded the jumps escalate even further. Even though the drills had only led the Zariman to orbit near Saturn, the Orokin's patience had reached its end, and they pressured the crew to execute a final, massive jump to cross the remainder of the distance to Tau. The colonists were furious. They made their disdain known and organized wide-scale protests aboard the ship. Given a taste of independence, they refused to become a sacrifice for the Orokin's impatience. Tavol, watching from afar, made his displeasure known and berated the colonists for their cowardice, even going so far as to limit food as punishment, which only worsened the situation aboard. Quinn, seeking to maintain order, brought the hammer down on the dissenters. He ordered Cavallero to round up the leaders and make examples of them. Weapons or no, Cavallero gathered those responsible for organizing the protests and showed the rest of the colonists that their cries were heard by the Orokin and would not be tolerated. But despite Tavol's orders as relayed through Quinn, the jump could not be made without properly calibrating the maneuver, so instead, the last burden of approval fell to Archimedean Yonta and her team. Yonta and the rest of the Void technicians, including Kira, ran the numbers and saw that the jump was possible, in theory. An extremely high chance of catastrophe, but possible. Still fearing to be seen as a failure, and desperate to prove herself to the Orokin, Yonta cast caution to the wind and gave her verdict. The jump would be safe, she said. This did little to ease tensions aboard the ship, as even those with no understanding of the mechanics of void travel knew that Yonta's claim was a lie. Kira's husband, already worn from the stress of keeping his fellow crew members in line, had a falling out with Kira, resentful that she had a part, no matter how small, in approving such a dangerous maneuver. Soon, he and Kira were no longer speaking directly, and he could only bring himself to leave passive messages via data tablet. Hombask, meanwhile, seeing that the protests were not working, sought a solution of her own. Her love of the crew led her to reckless action in the hope that even the Golden Lords, callous as they were, would not be able to ignore a grand act of defiance. Hombask vented the agridomes into space, killing all sustainable food sources aboard the ship and practically guaranteeing a failure of the colony. While her actions were from a place of well intent, the loss of the agridomes put a massive strain on the already limited food, and starvation became rampant. When her crewmates, those she had sought to protect, discovered she was responsible, she was ostracized. And while the Orokin did take note of such an offense, their reaction was not what Hombask and the other colonists had hoped for. Instead of calling off the project and remanding the Zariman, Tavol condemned the ship. If the colonists wanted to control the ship so dearly, that they could have it as their tomb. Quinn, knowing that the retribution of the Orokin would come not just to the colonists, but to the families still planetside, sought to earn back the Orokin's favor. They would execute the jump, make the best of what they were able to when they reached Tau, and hopefully, by some miracle, their families would be spared. The colonists, knowing that their slim odds were now even less due to the loss of the agridomes, organized one final protest, a desperate plea not just to the Orokin, but to the powers in control of the ship, to not give in to madness and doom them all to death. But the decision had been made, the order was given, and the reliquary drive was engaged. When the void was torn open and the Zariman dove into the depths, the sheer magnitude of the exposure required was too much, and it drew the eye of the indifference within. The void reached out and seized the Zariman like an insect in a web, and held them in its deep embrace, far beyond the eyes of the Orokin, and far beyond any hope of rescue. The void energy flowed through the ship like a poison and drove the vast majority of the colonists insane. Violence and bloodshed erupted as the gilded halls of the Zariman became charnel grounds. Brack, hyper-fixated on his final legacy, begged Mykos to send the message he had prepared, a final desperate goal as Brack saw the death begin to rise around them. Kira, in horror and guilt, locked herself in her dormizome as the void began to burn into her mind. Her husband, desperately seeking to reunite and reconcile with his wife amidst the rising horror, tried to reason with her from outside the dormizome as the chaos intensified, but Kira's mind was already gone. The children, entirely untouched by the madness of the void, barricaded themselves in their classrooms and dormizomes while their parents and loved ones screamed primal behind the doors, hungering for their death. Hombask, kept cruelly sane, was powerless to stop the very people she had tried to save, instead fighting through them to try and rescue the children. But with no combat ability, she was quickly torn to shreds by the feral colonists. Cavallero, warrior to the end, fought against the insane crew, and when he was finally overwhelmed, took himself and his killers in a blast from an improvised explosive. But unbeknownst to Cavallero and Hombask, the children were no longer in need of saving. For in one classroom, Arteno would come face to face with the beast who held the ship in its jaws, the Indifference. Arteno made the fateful bargain with the Void, and the children of the Zariman were granted the power to fight back, but at the terrible cost they would continue to pay for millennia. Kira's husband, still trying to reunite with her and escape to somewhere safe, would see this power firsthand, as Kira finally was seized from her stupor and burst forth from her dormizome to kill an emaciated child that had been scrounging nearby for supplies. Perhaps she saw something in the child that she recognized as the Void, as the poison infesting the ship. Or perhaps her mind was truly gone, and she was simply moving to kill anything that came too close. But when her husband called out to her, begged her to stop, the momentary pause when she recognized his voice was all the child needed to retaliate. Kira was burned to ashes by the power of the Tenno before her husband's eyes. Racked with guilt for the last things he had said to his wife in person before the jump, and believing himself to have been directly responsible for her death, Kira's husband ended his life to at last be free of the madness of the Zariman. Quinn, still surviving and seeking to rally as a responsible leader, took notice that the children were still sane. Working his way through the ship to try and gather them all to safety, he arrived too late. For the children no longer had any trust left for the adults of the ship, and Quinn was scoured by void fire like all the others, friend or not. Yonta, alone, seeing the death and destruction wrought from her false promise, ended herself by the jade light as so many of her fellow Archimedeans had been ended before her, and the sane few we would know later as the Holdfasts were, at last, all dead. But the ship was not safe. The surviving feral crew roamed the halls in hunting parties, seeking to kill the children who had rallied together. In the darkness of the Zariman, the children still served as a faint light, somehow finding scraps of joy within the living hell. But not all were welcome. Rel, outcast due to his nature, stayed alone. While he did not have the protection offered by his fellow children, he had insight. In the dark, he would focus on the whispers of the void and eventually latch onto it, ensnaring its essence in a web of his own. It is possible that Rel, in wrestling with the void itself, is directly responsible for the Zariman's appearance back from beyond the fold, far beyond the system, but breaching from the depths of the void long enough for the Orokin to take notice. When the Zariman resurfaced, however, a seemingly innocent payload was finally loosed from its communication buffers. Brack's message in a bottle was cast into the far reaches of space, towards its original intended target, the Cetus system. While the intended target may have merely been coincidental for the purposes of mystery hunting, leading players to the hints that were located in the Cetus hub during the ARG, the amount of focus that the message receives makes me believe that it may have been a clue with far more import, which is also why I believe that the Sentient Rail project took place prior to the Zariman. I believe that, whether or not Brack had intended the message to arrive where it did as a sort of time capsule ahead of the Zariman, or had merely sent it into the black on a whim, the message did find a listener. Tau. The sentients there, now fully living to their namesake, received the small packet of data, incomplete yet showing a cryptic indication of what the Orokin had intended, their home taken by interlopers from the Origin system. While this is a large amount of speculation, I believe that Brack's innocuous pet project is the inciting factor in spurring the sentients to return and initiate the old war. An open greeting, tragically intercepted as a threat. In the timeless ocean of the void, the children had endured for months, possibly even years, but for the Origin system, the Zariman was gone mere days, reappearing as if nothing had even happened. An Orokin officer by the name of Kayleen was among the first responders, and the children, furtive and starved, lashed out in fear, scarring her face with void fire. Seeing the ship and the surviving children as cursed by the void, the Orokin gathered the children for containment and study, and left the ship to rot far beyond the outer terminus, a monument to the failure of the colonists. In truth, the Orokin may not have even been able to move the ship had they tried, for the ship was sealed in place by the Albrecht membrane, a space between the worlds of dust and void that serves as both a threshold and a barrier, a wall that, while so thin as to be non-existent, still prevents the latent energies of the void and the influence that rides their currents to flood into the world of dust. On this thin space between worlds, the Drifter would remain, a ghostly reflection of the Tenno who made the deal, plucked from another timeline and imprisoned aboard until the actions of Ballast during the New War would cast our Tenno into the void and open the space for the soul of the Drifter to exist on our side of the wall. When Ballast attempts yet another, even more destructive sundering of the border during the conclusion of the New War, the catastrophic forces at play are enough to let the indifference fully breach through into our reality, if only for a moment. In the brief period on our side of the wall, it intones the void tongue, and its voice awakens the Zariman. Echoing with the indifference's ruinous speech, the dormant Zariman is recharged with the void, like a circuit waiting for completion, and the lingering echoes and ghosts of the Zariman accident become fully manifest. The Holdfasts and some others of the crew are fully resurrected, but with only a slight recollection of their past. Existing for centuries in a half-active state with little agency on their surroundings, they at least know that the souls of the colonists who had gone before them were ravaged and transformed by the chaos of the void, rendered into void slag and twisted mockeries of the human form. The risen ghosts band together and do everything they can to resist the same siren call that claws at their mind. But the horrors of the ship weigh heavily upon the hearts of even the dead, and it is not long before the risen crew give in to the call of the void and rejoin its chorus, soon leaving only the 5 we know as the Holdfasts. While the other Holdfasts hide away and attempt to shield themselves from the void song and resist its urge, Kira takes an active role. Fighting against void contamination and the non-linear laws of the threshold, she reaches out to the Tenno, aware of who they are and what they are capable of, as she possesses, like the other Holdfasts, a fragmented recollection of events that extended beyond her mortal life and even her own experiences, drawing knowledge from the reflections of timelines and realities that flow across the threshold and form the very fabric of the risen dead. Kira seeks the Tenno not just for their aid in defending the ship from the hapless raiders that would invite widespread chaos upon the system at large, but also in searching through the archives for information that might piece together the remaining fragments of her psyche. The Zariman ARG then takes place, and working with the player base at large, Kira sends numerous messages and files for the player base to decode. Her messages involve ciphers, spectrograms, hidden messages and web page data, riddles, IRC channels, in-game actions, and numerous other trappings of ARG puzzles, all slowly breaking through the void contamination and allowing her to speak with us more directly through voice recordings and bits of lore. With further assistance, she accesses the remaining archives of the ship and transfers old logs and hidden information she comes across. One such piece of information is a fairly obscure piece of Warframe lore, the Tale of the Princess of Mirrors. It is a fairly lengthy story hinting at the nature of the Void and its properties, and much of its imagery rings true to what we know of the Void now. The numerous mirrors in the palace serving as the parallels to the multiple timelines and realities within the Void, and the etched runes on the dungeon doorway perhaps relating to Albrecht's theorems or the Void tongue itself. The exact character parallels are far more open to interpretation, and it is my opinion they aren't meant to serve as direct links to any particular characters. However, I have seen some who interpret the old man may be Albrecht, Ballas, Teschen, or even the Drifter themselves. The princess could then be seen as Lotus or Margulis, though the moon would be a better link for them. But again, my personal interpretation sees the princess and the old man more as allegorical rather than specific stand-ins. I've narrated the story in a video I will link in the description, but if you find my narration grating, or would rather just read it for yourself, I've also linked the transcript of the story in as well. While Kira's efforts in accessing the archives continue to be successful, she begins to succumb to the call of the Void, pulled constantly by the alluring tones emanating from the silver corpses of the crew that cling to the walls of the ship. Perhaps her previous insanity made her weaker upon resurrection, more pliable for the Void song, but regardless, her resistance begins to falter. In the archives, she stumbles upon the messages left by her husband and confirms what she had known, but could not fully understand. She had long been dead, and was merely a ghost not yet taken by the Void. Unable to resist the call any longer, she thanks the Tenno for their assistance and succumbs, joining the rest of the souls who could not resist the Void as an angel, a moniker she gave them to remind herself of what they used to be. With the Zariman beset by threats from the far side of the wall, the Tenno returns to face their past and prevent it from further desecration, but does not arrive first. For when the Zariman was awoken, it began to sing, a call heard across the system, and it did not take long for the Corpus and Grineer to take notice and swarm upon its carcass. The Corpus seeking to simply pilfer Orokin-era tech for a profit, or perhaps looking for reliquary for Parvos Granum, but the Grineer with a far more dangerous goal in mind, the reliquary drive itself, the key to manipulating the Void. And as has been evidenced prior, the Void is itself key in facilitating Kuva and its immortalizing properties. We can even see Kuva being pooled in a vessel below the tip of the severed finger, further indicating why the Grineer are so desperate to claim the drive for themselves. Sent by the Worm Queen, still seeking to revive her dead sister, wanting to take one of the most direct and potent fonts of the old blood for herself. But even disrupting the delicate balance of Void energy and restarting the reliquary drive is enough to put the entire ship and its position on the threshold in danger. The initial assault by the Grineer on the reliquary proved enough to punch holes through the membrane, and a surge of the Void rushes through the ship, reawakening the newest dormant Void Angel, Kira. Invigorated by the rush of power, still fresh and conductive to the Void that shapes her new form, Kira's song is enough to severely disrupt the Tenno, two beings of the Void clashing their ruinous and reality-shaping powers. When the Tenno comes to, they have been rescued by the remaining Holdfasts, lamenting the loss of their compatriot, but hopeful that the Tenno may be their salvation. As the Tenno works to stabilize the ship and repel the interlopers, we see that the rush of the deep Void has allowed the Thrax to cross the threshold, ancient mirrors of Grineer from the height of the Orokin Empire, dredged by the Dominus and Duviri, and left to linger close to the edge, so that when the waters of the Void burst through the splits in the membrane, it drew many of the Thrax across as well. The Void also continues to work its typical mockeries in creating specters of the past. Some are helpful, like the ghosts of children who are either echoes from across time or remnants of those who did not survive to be recovered by the Orokin, but others are harmful, like the Skitter Girl, a coagulation of Yanta's childhood anxiety and self-destructive thoughts brought to life through conceptual embodiment, still a threat even when reflecting the minds of the dead. Despite the Tenno's best efforts, the continuing flood of void energies awakens more angels, which in turn tear new holes in the membrane for further void to flow. Kira, in particular, drinks the deepest of the void's power, not yet calcified and hardened like the older angels, but malleable to the void's desire. Her song becomes more and more powerful, and the connection she formed with the other Holdfasts, sharing their fears, their trauma, allows her angel form to resonate more strongly with them, manipulating their guilt and breaking down their defenses faster than the slow song of the other Void Angels. The Grineer, desperate to take the reliquary and leave the hellish Zariman, began to crack its shielding, drawing all the angels aboard to its location so that they might drink directly from the Void through its desiccated flesh. For, in order to maintain their fractured survival, the angels must continue to absorb raw energies of the Void, lest they fall dormant, harden, and eventually return to slag. And with Kira still freshly hatched, she is the most receptive to the sustaining power flooding from the reliquary. With Kira at her most resonant, the Holdfasts are no longer able to resist and start to become dissolute. The Tenno defeats Kira, and with the loudest voice in the choir silenced, the Song of the Void returns to a dull chant. As the song subsides, the membrane recovers and mends, turning the looming flood into a constant but manageable stream. But the damage Kira wrought was significant, and the Holdfasts were unable to resist her power. The Tenno mourns the Holdfasts briefly, but then discovers they survived. For in the moment when they lost their grip on reality and were pulled to drowning by their tether to the deep void, they found another anchor, a new source to draw upon instead of the dark words of the void itself, the Tenno. A source of stabilizing, benevolent void energy focused through a pure lens that does not slowly pull their souls apart at the seams, threatening to unmake them entirely, but empowers them just by the grace of the Tenno's presence. Quantum ghosts that collapse into the real and manifest when the light of the Tenno is cast upon them. Emboldened by the Tenno, the Holdfasts mark a memorial to the fallen, including Kira, and resolve to turn the Zariman back to a semblance of its former glory. Slowly, the Holdfasts begin to restore their past as the Tenno purifies the ship, as though the Void initially resurrected them as incomplete, fractured slates that made for tender prey. Their consistent exposure to the neutralized Void Angel material restores them. For the Angels are formed of the Void, and in their energy, the memories of the Zariman and its crew still linger. The Void substance comprising the Angels works similarly to Aya, Aya being the memory-storing medium for the Orokin, which was likely also derived from the Void in some manner, that held the Orokin's memories too when their immortal minds could no longer contain the centuries of their lifespans. The Holdfasts heal from the corrupting song of the Void, becoming more complete and more difficult for the Void to tear apart and consume as they build stronger walls of the self to keep the whispers out. They recall their actions, their deaths, and the guilt they must carry for eternity. But in eternity, they also see an opportunity. They recognize that the past is done, but there is still a chance to rebuild. Like the acrodomes that Hombask destroyed were repaired over the long, cold centuries and returned to lush, green life, the Holdfasts too have a chance to right the wrongs of the past. As Cavallero puts it, an eternity of second chances. A chance to atone for their crimes, a chance to restore the Zariman to what it was in the hearts and minds of the colonists who died aboard, a chance to protect the innocent from a dark and inscrutable god lurking in the deep. Thus, the Holdfasts resolved themselves to embody their namesake, to hold fast against the horrors and maintain their vanguard even as half-living specters while the Tenno serves elsewhere. And for now, while the Holdfasts continue to hold the membrane shut and prevent untoward crossing from either side of the wall, this is what we know.